brief overview of our series to ground us in today's discussion and how this fits in to where we're headed with this series. On our last webinar, we heard from several providers that were really on the forefront of integrative healthcare settings. And when I say integrative, I mean integrative, complementary and integrative healthcare practitioners that are working side by side with conventional medical community. And we've heard how they utilize research and research evidence to open the door and to continue that dialogue with our conventional medical colleagues. So today, what we're going to go ahead and do is really review our competency here that we developed at ACCAHC in evidence-informed practice, and actually a whole set of competencies that will help better prepare graduates for these types of integrative environments. In other words, what skills will be needed in these types of new care settings to move forward. And then on our third webinar, which is scheduled to take place in January, we'll hear from individual educators that have integrated portions of this competency into their curricula and how they've made that work. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of grounding for today's discussion. So without further ado, I did want to introduce our speakers today. First, we have John Weeks, who is our immediate past executive director here at ACCAHC and was the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Living Tribute Award for his 3 decades of work in the field. John has been a writer and organizer, executive and consultant in the field of integrated healthcare for over 2 decades. And he's helped organize some of the most significant multidisciplinary collaborative forums among disciplines and stakeholders, including the National Education Dialogue to Advance Integrative Healthcare, Creating Common Ground. John co-founded ACCAHC as part of that process, and he currently serves as an alternate member for ACCAHC at the Institute of Medicine Global Forum on Innovation in Health Professional Education. John publishes the Integrative blog and news reports, which is freely available at integrativeblog.com. And he currently writes columns for the Pain Practitioner, the Integrative Medicine, a Clinician's Journal, integrativepractitioner.com, and the consumer-oriented Alternative Medicine, and for the Huffington Post. John attended Stanford University and has been granted honorary doctorates from Bastyr University, National University of Health Sciences, and Canadian College of Natural Medicine. So welcome, John.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jan Schwartz, and Jan has worked and volunteered in the complementary and alternative healthcare field since 1993, and she has worked in education and training since 1988. She has served as the Director of Education at a massage school and taught numerous courses in that context. Currently, Jan is putting her energies into her online education business, Education and Training Solutions, which offers customized online education services. In addition to ACCAHC, her volunteer work includes serving on the Board of Trustees for the Massage Therapy Foundation, and she also teaches practice management at a local acupuncture school. So welcome, Jan.
Thanks, Deb.
And we also have with us today Dr. Stacy Gomes. Stacy is the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Pacific College of Oriental Medicine, where she's worked since 1997. She received her master's degree in education technology at San Diego State University and her doctorate in educational leadership at the University of La Verne. In addition to her work at Pacific, Dr. Gomes is a member of the Executive Committee for the Council of Colleges of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, co-chair of the CCAOM First Professional Doctorate Committee, and is a board member here at the Academic Consortium for Complementary and Alternative Healthcare, where she also serves on our education working group. So welcome, Stacy.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks for your work.
So a brief overview of today's agenda. As I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and discuss really the skill set that graduates will need to have to practice optimally in interprofessional team-based healthcare settings. And we're going to cover briefly the development process that spanned really almost 2 years and involved multiple healthcare professions. And the idea here is to really give you a better picture of who and why and how these competencies were developed. And the underlying goal then is to help you better understand our competency and evidence-informed practice. And so I also want you to be prepared that towards the end of our presentation today, you'll get really kind of a sneak peek or a first look at some of our draft learning objectives for this competency. And we're really hoping to get some feedback from those of you who are on the line. So please feel free to go ahead and type in any feedback or questions that you have along the way. And this will hopefully help us develop useful resources for you that are on the line today. So without further ado, I want to turn the presentation over to John.
Very good. Thanks, Deb. Pleasure to be back working with you all. The slide that's in front of you here is, I think, has all of our present members of ACCAHC. And just to give you the idea of the breadth of the organization, that really undertook the competency work. Most all of these were already members at the time in 2009. But today, joining this group, we also have about 60 individual colleges or universities that are accredited through federally recognized agencies. So this is the base is, for you who don't know, the 5 so-called CAM professions that have a federally recognized accrediting agency, and which is chiropractic, acupuncture, and oriental medicine, naturopathic medicine, massage therapy, the direct entry midwives or certified professional midwives. And then we have also some, on the right side, there's some emerging professions that don't have this same level of recognition but are engaged in self-regulatory or regulatory processes. So it's a real deep base that's founded in the organizations that are really the ground upon which all of these professions work and operate, with the focus on education, accreditation, and certification. Next slide. So as we got together, part of our idea was that if we wanted to move some energy in health and medicine, particularly in relationship to these professions, it might be best if we all figured out what our shared priorities were in this moment of integration. And as we grew, we had our first major meeting with members of each of our working groups, research, clinical, and education, and our board of directors met together, about 50 of us, in 2009 in Minnesota at Northwestern Health Sciences University. And our focus was doing basic work of examining where we had similar challenges, and so therefore where as a group we might take on something that would float all of our boats, that would be useful to all of us and useful to the people that we are seeking to serve. And in that process of work for those couple of days, we all came to realize that we're each of these disciplines perched at a point of opportunity that hadn't really been around before, because of the awakening interest of mainstream stakeholders in what our professions might mean, because of the awakening interest of many of our new students who were coming into our schools knowing they wanted to work not out in silos by themselves, but work deeply embedded in regular medical delivery or regular research. We hit on the idea that perhaps what we need to focus on is helping our people become more competent to practice in these kinds of environments. Next slide, Deb. So, this is really the context I was describing. Most of these fields have historically operated in pure silos, meaning the schools sit by themselves and then graduate people who go out and hang up a shingle. And with the changes and the desired changes for more people in more medical delivery environments to have access to these practitioners, we knew that there were some new skill sets we needed to develop in our people. Next slide, please. So the process began, and here as a non-educator, I remember being kind of stunned when everybody who, like Stacy and Jan, who were educators in the group, said, well, if we're going to do that, we need to start by determining what the competencies are to which we're seeking to educate people. And at the time, I thought, oh my God, this is just another way that these educators are going to slow down our work. And what it turned out to be was a fascinating, multidisciplinary, horizontal process that was, I think at the time, the deepest one that had ever been engaged by all of our disciplines together. And we did it through our 3 working groups that I mentioned before, clinical. Each of these have about 10 to 15 members, and they're all equally distributed across these professions. The ACCAHC board was involved, and at times we engaged some of our conventional medical and educator friends and colleagues in order to get some feedback from their perspective. Obviously, if we're integrating into worlds that they know better than us, it would be good to hear from them. Next slide, please. The process took about a year, and that meeting was in, I guess, May of 2009, and we published these back to our board of directors for approval in the fall of 2010. And the competency fields fell into these 5 categories that are in front of you here. And as you will see, the bottom 2 were kind of similar around this realization that our folks were coming from outside of regular institutional health care, and that there's so much change going on in medicine with the Affordable Care Act. This was 2009. It was in the height of the development of the Obama reform that was passed in the middle of early part of 2010. But we needed to focus more on what was going on, regular medical delivery, and what's going on with these changes. Up top, it was really a focus on realizing that we're operating in team care and interprofessional zones with those 2 fields. We had already identified this movement into the interprofessional dialogue that was was going to be a priority with ACCAHC. But the heart and soul of this talk is about the one in the middle, which was born out of a realization that typically, as any of our people are knocking on doors, or if anybody's inside of these institutions wants to bring some folks in, they end up with evidence questions. Is there any evidence? Of course, we know that there is, but that question is still out there. And so we need to have people who are competent in working with evidence and not being too defensive and knowing how to engage the process. And so that was one of the core fields. So there were these 5 fields, and there were 28 sub-competency elements connected to them. Next slide, please. So once we had the approval of the board, the next job really was beginning to figure out how can we create the information that will help our educators, our clinicians, our students around these competencies. And while we would have loved to have had a couple $1 million grant to do up this in a big way, what we rested on was often what we have, which is the volunteerism of our working group members. And we formed this Adopt a Competency Task Project, where we had individuals or groups of people from our working groups adopt one of the elements, and for it come up with the idea of a 1 to 2 hour module with the objectives of what the module would be, and then perhaps a list of references, reading materials for that, so we could begin to put together the skeleton of what a full-on educational program geared to these competencies would look like. So next slide. As we worked on that, as we advanced through the beginning of 2011, we were actually moving towards our biennial meeting where we thought we would roll out these competencies. It was scheduled for June of 2011. But on the way there, we learned that because we had begun to focus on interprofessionalism through one of our contacts, we learned that what we call the Big 6 disciplines in regular medicine, unbeknownst to us, had begun a process in almost exactly parallel path, where they were, again, for them historically, engaging a horizontal collaboration to set up their core competencies for interprofessional collaborative practice. And I happened to be in DC for other reasons and went to the National Press Club in May of 2011 when these were rolled out. Thank you, Deb. And while there, we spoke up and said, hey, we'd like to be part of your process. And the Allied Health, some of the other folks who were not included in the original process, also stood up. And they began to realize that once they were talking about teams, that the teams were indeed going to be much more significant than the sort of nurse to doc to pharmacist to public health sort of set that they thought originally with these competencies they were going to be focusing on. I think at this point, this is where I pass on to my colleague of many years, Jan Schwartz, to pick it up, because it was at the biennial meeting the next month that she and her co-chair of the Education Working Group had a rather brilliant idea. So take it, Jan. I can't hear Jan.
Yeah, I can't hear Jan either. I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulty.
Are you on mute, Jan?
If we can get Jan off mute.
Yeah, Jan was on mute, actually. She had to get the cat out of the room, so she was on mute. So let me start that again. We had some space at the June biennial meeting to break up into our working groups, and right before we broke up, we had most of us, a lot of us hadn't heard about the IPEC document and hadn't really had an opportunity to review it. So the education working group, and Mike Wiles, Dr. Mike Wiles was my co-chair at the time, we decided that we needed to look at what they did before we did any more work on our own document. And I'm not remembering exactly, but there must have been about 10 of us of the working group who were able to make that meeting. So we decided to take, and Stacy was there. So we took that, the IPEC document, we scrambled to get that. I think we got it printed, or a lot of us brought it up on our devices. And we decided we would put it side by side. So that last bullet point was our work at all aligned with IPEC, because it was just sort of freaky that we were doing work in parallel and neither group knew what the other was doing. So next slide, please, Deb. So these were the people who were at the 2011 retreat, and I would venture to say that every single person at some time or another in this group was involved with the ACCAHC competency work. And I went back yesterday and took a look at the listserv that I had as co-chair of the Education Working Group, and there were 66 people involved overall. I think someplace it's written that there were 50, but there were closer to 70 actually people involved in this work. And I'm bringing that up here because I think it's important for people to know that this was not a small task force of 5 or 10 people who decided what these competencies would be in working in integrative environments. We had a lot of feedback. And as one of the people who was heading up this project, I'll tell you, herding cats is, it put new meaning for it to me, because 66 people, volunteers, I mean, getting them all together to get this work done was at times frustrating, but in the end extraordinarily rewarding. So I learned patience, and I was I personally was well rewarded by that. So next slide, please. So when we put these two documents together, and we did this really in the time we had allotted to us at that June 2011 meeting. But you can see here the comparisons. We had 5 core professions plus 16 different organizations involved with our competencies, and they had 6 core professions. We began in the fall of 2009 and basically ended in August 2010, at least the first iteration. They too began in the fall of 2009, and their work was published in 2011. So my guess is they probably finished somewhere in 2010 as well in order to get it published. We were working with 5 competency fields, and they happened to be working with 4 competency fields. But when we put these things side to side, basically what we found was incredible overlap. I mean, it was just extraordinary to us, and a little bit freaky, I have to say. So we were checking off the competencies and the elements between the two, and we found that there were a few things that they had, 3 to be exact, I think, that we wanted to maintain in our competencies that they did not include in theirs. And next slide, please, Deb. So the one was in the field of values and ethics. We decided we needed to demonstrate personal behaviors and self-care practices that reflect optimal health and wellness. And we thought about that for quite a while, and we decided we needed to have that because we felt that our disciplines were really needing to be able to model these kinds of practices for students and for our graduates. And it's kind of interesting to me that at this moment in time, the conventional disciplines, if you will, are also beginning to look really closely at this particular document. They did not add it to their competency document, but if you look around, there are a lot of people talking about, to doctors and DOs and nurses, about self-care and about personal behaviors that in fact do reflect optimal health and wellness. So I personally am really glad we left that in, and I sometimes wonder if people who are reading our documents from the conventional side didn't say, wow, we need to be looking at that too, because burnout, as we know, in healthcare is pretty huge. The other 2 things that, well, we didn't actually add, but we rearranged our competencies. So we wound up with 6. And the 2 that we sort of divvied up and left by themselves was evidence-based healthcare and evidence-informed practice, and institutional healthcare culture and practice. And we felt that these were important for a couple of reasons. One, certainly you can go ahead and go to the next one, Deb, thanks. The evidence-based healthcare and evidence-informed practice, which is our competency 5, and which Stacy will take you through in a little bit more detail and give you some ideas about how you might be able to help incorporate this into your curriculum, is that evidence is the language of integration. And let me just take 1 second and read the general competency statement for this competency. It's explain, evaluate, and apply scientific evidence in the context of practitioner experience and patient preferences, and apply evidence-informed decision-making in integrative healthcare delivery. So as you can see from the slide, and probably you may know from your own practice, the complementary and integrative healthcare disciplines haven't had quite the research portfolio that conventional medicine has, and there are a couple reasons for that. And one is that when you have something like the randomized control trial as a gold standard, it's a really hard standard to apply to our disciplines, because we do need to take into account practitioner experience and patient preferences. So at this point, I think talking a little bit about why, a little bit more about why this competency is so important might be a good thing, Deb. So maybe either John or Stacy would like to weigh in and talk a little bit about why they think it's important.
You know, I could butt in here before it goes to Stacy, which is it's actually to speak to both why we had it in there, and actually is a growing awareness of the value of each of these as we have worked with our colleagues in regular medicine. And so one is this, you know, the disturbing awareness that, as I sometimes put it, that the last thing you want to have is a perfectly performing team doing perfectly the wrong thing. And if a third of what we do in regular medicine is unnecessary and much of it harmful, as the Institute of Medicine has concluded, we want people who are very good with evidence, with research, to be calling hold if something that the team is heading towards is not actually appropriate. And that requires some of the same kinds of subtlety of expression, of communication around evidence that, of course, is asked of our practitioners when they're trying to enter these environments. Similarly, with our Competency 6, again, we thought of this originally as us who've been externalized, trying to figure out the ins and outs of regular medicine. But as the Affordable Care came out and we started hearing about patient-centered medical homes, accountable care organizations, as the medical industry was moving towards a values-based delivery, it became very clear also that everyone, in order to function in this emerging environment, needed to have higher levels of skills about the intent, the criterion for most appropriately working as a values-based system instead of one that's just focusing on production of procedures. So we've ended up coming to realize that frankly, in the whole interprofessional world, it wouldn't hurt for everyone to have these two competency fields as well.
Yeah, John, thanks for that, the overview of the national perspective. And one of the things that I like to talk to Deb Hill about too is, you know, being boots on the ground here at Pacific College. One of the things that I have observed certainly over the last 2 decades is the challenge that faculty have with modeling evidence-informed practice, and even getting into the literature and understanding how to filter an article so that they can make some sense of it and help students think through it. So this is extremely important in the growing era of the triple aim, and really looking at what does this mean for patient effectiveness, patient satisfaction, comparative effectiveness, you know, bringing down healthcare costs. There's so many implications. I felt so strongly about this particular competency that, and I pushed to have it in the new first professional doctoral standards through the Accreditation Commission, and also was successful in getting our college to provide an annual alumni award for students that demonstrate these competencies, and we do particularly focus on this one. It's really not just about evidence-based medicine, which I have seen a transition and a pushback from our faculty on, but really understand how evidence should inform your thinking and how you model that for students. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Stacy. You know, the other thing that I want to just point out here, if for those of you who are not familiar with the R25 grants, That really facilitated moving this forward. They were grants that were given to some, generally I think, multidisciplinary universities to facilitate the culture of evidence-informed practice among the complementary and integrative healthcare disciplines. And so those grants, you'll find some information on them on the Pearl website, some of the outcomes of those grants, which are some years old now, would be on that website. So if you want to take a look at them, I would highly suggest that you do that. We're not really talking about the institutional healthcare culture and practice today, but that was another competency that we felt that we had to hold on to. And as John said earlier, most of the disciplines within ACCAHC were practicing in silos. I think we're seeing some pretty significant changes, and I would like to think that ACCAHC had a big part in that, and people who are involved with ACCAHC have had a big part in changing that landscape, and Stacy is certainly one of those people. But we needed to understand each other's healthcare culture and practice, and we needed to understand how we could work in inpatient and outpatient settings, since most of us don't work that way, and most of us are not taught in school how we might work in those settings. So to go back to competency, that was competency 6, and that was these are the 2 competencies that we chose to keep within our competency document, and we still think that this is really important, and we suggested to IPEC that they might want to take a look at it, but I think that they probably think they're already there. So next I would like to pass this on to Stacy so that she can give you, no, I guess not yet. Hold on, Stacy. I have one more slide.
I'm trying to see where we're at here.
Yeah, maybe 2 more slides. So I guess I already talked about this. The overview is that we have 6 major competency fields, and 4 of those competencies are pretty much aligned with IPEC, and we added 5 and 6. So now we can go to the next slide, Deb, please. And we did get endorsement, which I think is also very important, from multiple member organizations, and these are those organizations who endorsed us. And ACCAHC is a supporting organization to IPEC. So in addition to the support that we got from the Council of Colleges in Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, we also received endorsement for Competency 5 from the Society for Acupuncture Research. I mean, that's basically what they do, and that's what they felt comfortable endorsing. So we appreciate that. But these were formal endorsements. So, you know, we have buy-in from all of the disciplines within ACCAHC, and we've presented these, we've written an article about the competency process, we've done a poster, and we've done presentations. So the word is out there, and I'm going to pass it on to Stacy now so that you could get some idea of how you might integrate this into your own curriculum.
Thanks, Jan. Trying to get back into my slides here, see where we are. So the competency that we're looking at today is the evidence-based healthcare evidence-informed practice. And Jan read you the general competency statement: explain, evaluate, and apply scientific evidence in the context of practitioner experience and patient preferences, and apply evidence-informed decision-making in integrative healthcare delivery. This is a big mouthful and a lot of things happening here. And as an educator, I certainly look at this in a broad context across the curriculum, across programs, and looking at, you know, how is a student demonstrating this? How are our faculty actually modeling this in the classroom, in the clinic, and really trying to weave this into not only program learning outcomes, but course learning outcomes and micro assignments. You know, where is this stuff really happening at? And working with our faculty across the nation and looking at their assignments that really are, you know, student-centered and thinking, okay, what does this really look like in the classroom? So if we go to the next slide, Deb, under Competency 5, we have 7, I don't know, we call them sub-competencies. What are we calling them now, Deb?
I think sub-competencies is what we're doing.
Sub-competencies. Right. We have these competencies with these 7 sub-competencies. So these are broad and allow a lot of leeway and latitude with faculty developing assignments and guidance. But one of the things that really came to the top for Deb and I as we have been looking at this, when I think back over the 5 years of really, turn my webcam on here, I know that oftentimes makes it better to contextualize and see my facial expressions, because when I think back over the 5 years, you know, when it's funny to think of Act 1 and Act 2, because Act 1, the Adopt a Competency Task Force, we really set out to create these modules. And coming up to Bastyr, I believe that was in 2010, to share our work and our modules and such excitement before we really knew about IPEC. And before we really dug into, we thought we were doing great work. But what's interesting is when you go into the next slide and really look at the breakdown of the separation of some of these ideas, what we looked at was these EP 1, 2, and 3, and 6 are really broad in the context of all healthcare. And I believe if you flop back, Deb, to the next slide, is the EP 3, 4, and 7,
correct,
which is really focused on the CAM professions. When we look at these 3, this is where our faculty and students are really struggling with. So go back up to the other slide when we look at these broader ones. I've actually thought about reordering these, Deb. I think you and I talked about this. And I mean, it's challenging to go back and think about this because these competencies have been adopted by many organizations, and really, really happy about that. So anytime anybody goes that we work with on our teams talks about going in and editing and modifying things, you know, it's alert for me because we had so many people sign off on this, and it wasn't easy. It took time for organizations to sign off on all these competencies. So when you look at these 4, these are really very broad in the context of any healthcare profession. Explain the role of scientific evidence in healthcare in the context of practitioner experience and patient preference. Okay, that one's pretty generic, and that should be a pretty low-level outcome. Now, EP2, describe common methodologies within the context of both clinical and mechanistic research focusing on an assessment of your own field. I do see some challenges with this thinking with the methodology piece of it, because so much of the resistance from our faculty and students have been around the gold standard and the RCT, and really thinking that we can't possibly embrace evidence-informed practice, thinking that it's just that methodology, but really teaching students and faculty about the evidence hierarchy and really understanding the roles of different methodologies related to the question. That has been a real challenge. I've taught research for 10 years and oversee the doctoral research, and I constantly come back to this challenge of the method fits your question and trying to really align this with the thinking. EP5, apply fundamental skills in research evaluation. This is a pretty big one, and I talked to Jennifer Stone, the editor of Meridian's journal, about this idea of really looking at a filter for teaching practitioners and faculty about evaluating research. There are many tools out there available for to use as a filter for articles, and really looking at its validity and reliability and credibility, all that stuff. EP6, demonstrate evidence-informed decision-making in medical care. Well, this really is where the rubber hits the road, and if people want to look at the relationship to evidence-based medicine and stack it and really thinking about how is this changing in the era of affordable care and the triple aim and your role as a decision maker with your patient, and really looking at the multiple bubbles in the SACIT model of patient preferences, evidence, and then your experience. We really have to really look at that and make sure that practitioners understand that. So these are basic, and all medical schools will teach these four. When we go to the next slide to the other three that make up some of the challenges within our professions, this is where it starts to get challenging. Discuss contemporary issues in integrative practice research, including those relative to evaluating whole practices, whole systems, disciplines, patient-centered approaches, and health outcomes. These are big. These are big topics that are evolving and growing and changing, and it's hard enough for our graduates, alumni, students, faculty to keep their eye on their practice, much less good studies that really define some of their decision making. But some of these other ideas about whole practices, whole systems, disciplines versus modalities, patient-centered approaches, this becomes now even bigger, scarier, and really thinking, oh, how am I going to tackle all this? This is a real big one that we need to figure out, you know, as institutions, as trainers, as role models, coaches through ACCAHC, and really figuring out how can we condense this in a digestible form. EP4, analyze the research base within one's own discipline, including the positive and negative interactions, indications, and contraindications for one's own modalities and agents. This is big too, and Deb and I were working on this, really looking at this and talking about safety and really making clear that we can teach this in such a way that our graduates can really speak to the safety issues. EP7, discuss the value of evidence-informed risk management plan. And again, here, this is the same thing, because we still are faced with going into organizations, hospital settings, where people still question the safety of some of our modalities and disciplines. So these three are very much focused on the CAM professions, and I don't think you're going to see these three in the IPEC at all. As a matter of fact, I think what they have, if you go back up to that other slide, Deb, they had very little of this within their competencies anyway, because as we learned when we did the alignment, that the medical schools and the Big Six already encompass much of this teaching within their curriculum and programs anyway. So I think my memory is that there's very little of this EIP stuff in the IPEC. Do you want to comment on that, John or Jan?
Yeah, we went this, John. We went through theirs with a fine-tooth comb, and there's actually one of their sub-competencies that refers to it, and this is the place where, honestly, I think that they because we know that so much that's done in regular medicine does not have a good evidence base, and it's done inappropriately, we actually, I think, can very comfortably suggest that while there's an assumption, let me put this in other terms. I know like naturopathic doctors will say that we're definitely mind-body practitioners, but they may not know John Kabat-Zinn's work, and they may not know some of the best evidence-informed work. In this case, I think that there's a generalist belief that what they do is evidence-based or evidence-informed, yet our healthcare is suffering because so much of it is not, and therefore more attention to this. And I would say, Stacy, I love the way you've broken these out here, that I think even the competency, what was it, 4 about whole systems, and the new on the next slide, you know, as we drift over towards looking at what do we need in research to deal with people with any chronic diseases, separate from whether or not they're getting acupuncture or massage, but they will tend to be seeing a number of people the best care for diabetes is definitely multimodality, and for most conditions is. And so I would, again, I think that we can be somewhat less sort of defensive about our specialness and a little bit more assertive that what we identified has actually a much broader application.
Yeah. So if we go to the next slide, we started at Act 2. Lila, we like to call it Act 2. We're moving into more of distilling down these competencies into more, maybe if you could say, course learning outcomes from an educator's perspective, so that we can start looking at assignments, assessments, and this is going now into the weeds now, into EP3. So we have the broader sub-competency, discuss contemporary issues in integrative practice research, including these relative to value and whole practices, whole systems, disciplines, patient-centered approaches, and health outcomes. So then we have the goal of understand research design to take account of whole practice design among complementary integrative health and conventional healthcare systems. So then we have these development of some of, well, what does that really look like in the classroom, on the ground? So this is our first draft. You guys are the first people that are seeing this. Kind of exciting. Describe CAH discipline-specific whole practices within pharmacological biomedical research. Okay, so that's a good starting point. Identify methodological issues that are common to research in CIH and whole practice. Well, that's a great starting point because the methodology is quite different and evolving with mixed methods and comparative effectiveness, certainly. You know, the work of Claudia Witt and other colleagues that are doing a lot of this work is very impressive. And so if people just look at that and understand that the methods are mixed methods and that they're really encompassing many qualitative practices to look at the whole person, whole systems. Illustrate the challenges of evaluating whole practice research and the limitations of research that does not address them. That discussion in itself will be very rich. It's already happening in our the fundamentals of evidence-informed practice class that we teach here at Pacific College, and I can see this discussion really getting people's, you know, their interest. They like talking about the limitations and how this might look different in the future. So this is a great one, very Socratic dialogue-ish type of stuff. Discuss the implications of integrated medicine research combining both CIH and conventional practices. Again, mixed methods, and there are implications that we see with people that or I want to say practitioners that question the minimalistic approach of quantitative research biomarkers such that it doesn't look at the whole system. So we have to talk about that. Next slide, Deb, is I think there's more on EP3, or does that go into EP4? That goes into EP4.
We're ready into EP4, yep.
Okay, so analyze research traits within one's own discipline, including the positive and negative interactions, indications, contraindications for one's own modalities and agents. Okay, there's the sub-competency, and then we have the goal of keeping current with research surrounding the risks for various modalities and disciplines. Okay. So identifying the need for information, formulate a searchable clinical question, perform searches of the primary literature, critically appraise relevant research, including clinical practice guidelines, best practices on the risks associated with your treatment, and then understand research on positive and negative interactions for clinical practice. This all seemed really good. As we worked on these, we tried to take them from lower to higher and really think about what would somebody be doing, need to do in their practice to collaborate, to really be informed on this. And we believe this is a good starting point, and we're really anxious to hear what people think, if there's any questions. Yeah. Early focus group. Right, Deb?
Definitely. Anybody who has questions, please go ahead and type them into your GoToWebinar platform. We'll try to get to those here as we're getting towards the end.
Yeah. We'll skip through these last, I think there's one more, maybe,
EP7.
Deb?
Yep.
EP7. And this, again, is the risk management stuff. Yeah. Reading this here. Again, potential interactions. So this is our starting point. Next slide, Deb. Pearl Work Act 2. I think this is you, Deb.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're coming towards the end of our presentation as well. So I do welcome folks to type in those questions as we move along. And this is really, as we talked about, as Stacy had spoke about, Pearl we call Act 2. So we've continued that work from our Adopt a Competency Task Force back in 2010, which again was with a little bit different flair to the evidence-informed practice competency. But what we're headed to do and have a resource available to you all, to educators, looking at first quarter here of 2016, where we break apart each of those sub-competencies. So there were 7 of them, as Stacy had outlined. And for each and every one, we would have an overview that would kind of describe the goal, the little bit of background on the competency, the sub-competency, excuse me, those learning objectives, some of those draft ones that you just saw today, a set of resources. So if we look at maybe textbooks, some articles, you look at classroom handouts, or maybe even a video snippet. And then maybe a suggested classroom activity, something that you could do within your classroom, within an hour-long classroom, and then a short example of what it really looks like to be competent in each of those sub-competencies. So this is what we're working on developing as a freely available resource for educators to help continue that work into Act 2, as we put it. And so what we've previewed is a little bit here today. We really look for any of your feedback and something that would make this most useful to you as an educator to be able to put into place into your curriculum, your institution. And I welcome you to send any feedback that you'd have towards me directly as we move along here. So I want to give us time for some questions. I know we're towards the end, so I'll skip the summary page because I know we have some questions coming up, and we do have a webinar again coming up in January, and that'll be available on our website. So I'll leave you with I want to thank all of our presenters today. Thank you so much for joining us, and all of you who have tuned in today. Our website again is at optimalintegration.org, where you can find a number of our resources, and you can feel free to contact me directly as well. So Jennifer, my colleague, is also on the line. If I know that we have a couple questions that have come in. If you want to go ahead and we can get to some of those while we still have a little bit of time here.
Sure, Deb. The first is, what is the definition of and criterion for evidence?
So I throw that back out to each of our speakers to give a shot at that. Anyone want to take the first go?
Oops, you're on mute, Stace.
Sorry. There I am. I unmuted. I certainly teach the evidence hierarchy as a baseline, like knowing what the pyramid is, like just at least as a starting point of recognizing what the scale is and how you might use those. Wayne Jonas actually has a newer model. I forget the name of it, but we've been advised. The evidence house. Thanks, John. And we talk about maybe possibly not introducing that quite yet within our fundamentals of evidence-informed practice class, because it's a pretty advanced thinking. And right now, at this point, we want our students and faculty to really embrace the evidence pyramid as a starting point. It's a baseline for them to understand the most accepted evidence that is out there. It's not just an RCT, that their evidence is a case study also. There are multiple methods. So if you haven't seen the evidence hierarchy, I would advise you to just Google it. You can see it. It's very simple. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, let me add on. I think I'm a big fan of Dr. Jonas's Evidence House. If you can Google that up, any of you, if you look at Wayne Jonas Evidence House, he published this in 15 years ago or something. You know, Stacy, I'd urge you to teach them this, because it's something that brings the evidence discussion closer to home. What I like about it is he arranges the different types of studies, not so much in a hierarchy, but by who is it that you want to influence. So that, for instance, an employer, you know, somebody in sports, the military, they're more likely to care about outcomes research than efficacy trials, because what they really care about is performance. And so as you work with the evidence house, they I think it brings kind of the exotica of what happens inside of the NIH out into truly what we're trying to influence more, which is what's going on in the world. So I understand where you want to get that pyramid in people's minds. I hope that you just caveat it by saying that it's come out of some a history of thinking that unfortunately has actually led us to where we are in U.S. medicine. I think a more practical approach might be better.
Yeah, this is Jan. I teach a research literacy and evidence-informed practice at a local accredited acupuncture school, and I have to say that I found I know that about Wayne Jonas's evidence house, and I too started with the evidence pyramid. I introduced them at the end of the course to the evidence house simply because it's a little bit more complicated to explain, and once they have the information throughout a whole quarter, then the evidence house, I think, makes a little bit more sense and easier to explain, but I think it's a very valuable tool.
Yeah, I think John makes a good point. And looking at, again, I just pulled it up, it's really very focused on the audience preferences. Who is your audience, and really thinking about how you might use a piece of evidence for that. So thanks for reminding me about that, John. And I know I've gone back and forth with Bo Anderson about this inclusion.